Have you ever considered getting on antidepressants or anti-anxiety meds, especially because no matter what you seem to do, you can't seem to get these moods to change, especially the low moods? Have you ever been prescribed antidepressants, antipsychotics, or anti-anxiety medications? Our doctors often prescribe because they want to fix the symptoms in front of them. But have we ever considered where depression even comes from? Is it genetics, diet, lifestyle? What all encompasses these low moods? And how can we correct it for the long term for root cause healing? Hey guys, my name is Judy Cho and I'm board certified in holistic nutrition. And I have a private practice where we focus on root cause healing. And that often starts with the Carnivore Cures all meat elimination diet. Today, I had the pleasure of sitting down with Dr. Georgia Eid. She is a psychiatrist and she eats a meat-based diet. We talk about her journey into why she decided to eat animal-based and how much nutrition also affects her psychiatric practice. We talk about what SSRIs do, why we believe that serotonin or an imbalance of serotonin or a chemical imbalance is the cause or what we believe to be the cause of depression and other low mood factors. If you have ever taken or considered taking these medications, I highly recommend watching this interview. This is an area that I suffered from before carnivore, so it is very near and dear to my heart. Let's get right into the interview. Hi, Dr. Eid. I am so grateful and excited to be sitting down with you and just talking about all things meat. For the people that are watching, if you can introduce yourself.
Hi, Judy. Thanks for inviting me. My name's Dr. Georgia Eid. I'm a psychiatrist and I specialize in nutritional and metabolic psychiatry.
So I used to have a psychiatrist because I was suffering from major depression and an eating disorder. I asked them about nutrition. They said it has nothing to do with why I was sick. I totally believed it and I was plant-based. How did you make the shift into how diet can actually affect your mental health?
A lot of clinicians, the way that we come to start to think about nutrition and mental health and physical health is through our own experiences. And so when, for example, we can't help ourselves using the knowledge that we were given in our clinical training, then we start exploring other ideas. And so that's exactly what happened to me, which was, I had some health challenges in my early 40s that conventional medicine wasn't able to help with or understand. And so that's when I started experimenting with my diet. And then once I understood, or once I experienced the fact that kind of turning my diet upside down in these rather unorthodox ways, that was what was truly healing for me. That's when I first started studying nutrition. I had never studied nutrition before that. So I think that a lot of us have come to these approaches through our own health, because of our own health issues.
Yeah, no, and I think that makes a lot of sense, especially since you really have to go against the tide to share this information. I can't imagine starting to marry your practice and then adding this part of it. How did you start doing that with your patients?
Yeah, so the first I didn't begin incorporating nutrition strategies into my practice right away because I didn't understand how the diet was working. So I was using what was happening for me was primarily physical issues, and so those resolved with a mostly meat ketogenic diet that was many, many years ago. But I didn't understand why that worked. And I was honestly worried that the diet was going to kill me because of everything I thought I understood about fat and meat and cholesterol and animal foods in general. And so I was eating an extremely low plant diet at that point. And so I felt like it wouldn't be the right thing to do to introduce this to my patients when I didn't understand it myself. And I certainly don't want to hurt anybody. But as I was saying, I started eating this way to help my physical issues. But what I noticed, this was a complete surprise, was my mental health improved too. And I wasn't really aware of any major mental health issues, but I couldn't believe how much better I felt in terms of my mood, my anxiety, sleep, energy, mental clarity, ability to get things done. And I thought to myself, well, this diet seems to be good for the brain. So I'm a psychiatrist. So I wonder if this diet could help some of my patients. But before I launch into that, let me learn. And so I spent several years reading, studying nutrition science, and really getting to the bottom or trying to get to the bottom of what is true about nutrition and the brain. And I think it will continue to be a lifelong endeavor because there's always more to learn. But it took me, I think, maybe 4 years or so before I decided to offer nutrition counseling as part of what I was doing. That's when I was working at Harvard University Health Services. I offered that alongside medication management.
And then from your research, I mean, a lot of people, or maybe mainstream, we think, I mean, even when I took an SSRI, I was told that maybe I have an imbalance of my neurotransmitters, my serotonin, it's not staying in the brain. From your research, what do you think is causing some of the depression and anxiety that we see so much now, even more so than ever before?
It really is a global mental health crisis at this point. And I think 1 in 6 people in the United States take psychiatric medication, at least one psychiatric medication. And so those numbers are rising around the world as well. So it's a serious issue. And depression is now the number 1 cause of disability in the world. But I'm not convinced, and I think a lot of people are not convinced that for example, that depression is a straightforward serotonin deficiency disease. So the reason, just to explain to people who might not be familiar with these medicines, so the most commonly prescribed type of antidepressant, these are called the serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and really the way they're medicines like Prozac and Zoloft and Celexa and Lexapro, Paxil. Those medicines, the way we're told they're supposed to work is by helping serotonin in the brain to work better. And that we're taught in psychiatry residency that part of the issue was a chemical imbalance, that there wasn't enough serotonin, or it wasn't working properly, wasn't working well enough. So we prescribe these medicines to help support serotonin in the brain. But the science behind the serotonin deficit theory in psychiatry is extremely weak. And as a psychiatrist, prescribing these medications for more than 20 years, every day, day in and day out for more than 20 years, I certainly saw these medicines help some people, but they didn't work for most people. And even when they would work, sometimes they would, in fact, frequently they would stop working. And sometimes they would make people much worse. And so they certainly weren't the solution. They were really, really inadequate treatment, and sometimes absolutely the wrong treatment for a good number of people. So most people did not benefit to the extent that we would have hoped. So clearly the serotonin deficit theory is not strong enough to, for us to be able to be able to turn this tide around, to be able to help more people truly heal, as I know you are often saying on your channels, that helping people really heal on a deeper level. These medicines weren't improving brain health. They were maybe propping a particular part of brain chemistry up in some cases. So what we now understand, and what nutritional psychiatry and metabolic psychiatry, what those fields, what we believe is that we need to start asking, even if there is a serotonin imbalance, what's causing that imbalance in the first place? I don't think it's the root cause for most people, but some people do respond to these medicines. So what is causing that imbalance in the first place? And when you dig into the science of brain chemistry, what you begin to understand pretty quickly is that serotonin is just one tiny, tiny piece of the puzzle when it comes to brain health. And really, there are many, we understand so much more about what causes mental illnesses now than we did even 10 years ago. There are many driving factors, but the 3 most important ones, they are inflammation. So inflammation of the brain, something called oxidative stress, where you have too many free radicals in the brain. They're kind of like little bulls running around in a china shop and damaging everything they run into. And insulin resistance. And insulin resistance, which is now most of us have insulin resistance now, a metabolic disorder that's caused by diet and other lifestyle choices. Insulin resistance restricts the brain's access to energy. So you have inflammation, oxidation, and an energy deficit. And when you don't have enough energy, and when you've got all kinds of damaging inflammation and oxidation going on, the brain will not be healthy. The brain will not work properly, whether you have enough serotonin in your synapses or not. So we use nutrition to heal the entire brain, not just one tiny aspect of its workings.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. When I was on the SSRIs and then just doing some basic research on how there are more people taking SSRIs nowadays, and if it was truly just we are deficient or imbalanced in serotonin, then an SSRI, which inhibits the uptake of these serotonins, then everyone should be healed if that was truly the X equal, right? And so, yes. And then that's when I noticed, because for me, it didn't really work either. And I ended up getting on, I think it was Zyprexa or like a antipsychotic in addition to that, but struggling yes. with an eating disorder, it doesn't help that makes you gain weight.
No.
Right. No.
And I'm familiar with your story, and I was reading that about that piece of your story, and that is an extremely common side effect. I mean, weight gain is a common side effect of most psychiatric medications, not all, but most. The antipsychotic medications, even the serotonin medications, frequently can cause weight gain, and a lot of the anticonvulsant medications that we use as mood stabilizers and for anxiety can cause weight gain. And it's the last thing most people want. It's not just the last thing they want, not just from a vanity perspective, but it's also extremely unhealthy because the antipsychotic medications in particular, and some of the other psychiatric medicines as well, they cause insulin resistance. They cause blood sugar levels to go up. They cause insulin levels to go up, and they make it more difficult for people to have good metabolic health. And so what you have is you'll see blood sugar go up. You'll see triglycerides go up. You might see blood pressure go up. You'll see people develop type 2 diabetes. And these medicines shorten people's lives by years or decades because they develop all of the complications that come along with poor metabolic health. So even when they do help, and the antipsychotics do help far more people than the antidepressants do, there's still a huge price often that needs to be paid for that relief. So these are far from perfect tools.
And then in terms of nutrition, so when we just talk about, well, nutrition can help so much. So does that mean that if I were to eat a paleo diet that has a lot of nuts, just whole foods, is that sufficient to have me heal when I'm eating, maybe I eat mostly plant-based foods, but then I have a little bit of meat? Is that enough to get people healing? Because personally for me, that wasn't enough.
And it wasn't enough for me either. So the solution for me, and I know for you, was to, the less plant foods, the better. But in my clinical work as a nutrition consultant, I work with many different types of diets, and I help people improve the quality of their diets and the brain healthiness of their diets in whatever ways I can, in whatever ways they are open to. So it's very flexible, it's very personalized. And it's definitely not, and I know that you work in this way too. It's not dogmatic. It's not as though I say the only diet that I will work with you, the only diet that I will help you change to is a carnivore diet. I use carnivore diets in my practice. Sometimes people stay on them long term, but in most cases, I'm using them as an initial strategy for people who have tougher issues. And also for people who want to use a carnivore diet. But I use paleo diets in my practice. I use ketogenic diets, and I think that I've definitely seen some people. All they need to do is improve the general quality of their diet, remove the most egregious plant foods, which include the grains, the legumes, nightshades, those sorts of things. And sometimes that's all you need to do. You get all of the junk out and just eat kind of the kinder, gentler plant foods, as I like to say. But for a lot of people, that's not enough. And it depends on the person. As you know, it depends on the person. So some people have more gut damage than others. Some people have more immune issues than others. Some people have more metabolic dysfunction than others. So different strategies work for different people.
No, I fully agree with that. When I first started my practice, I thought, oh, all meat carnivore fixed me, so I'm just going to advocate for all meat carnivore, until you realize it doesn't work for everyone, especially when there's so much psychology around nutrition. So if a perfect diet or an all meat perfect diet makes you end up falling every 3 days, then it's better to be less perfect, and what will allow you to stay more consistent. So I think there's a lot of things in play when it comes to diet. So I fully agree. If my client, as much as nuts aren't ideal for you, if that's what will allow them to stay more consistent to meat-based, I will tell them. And so some of them get shocked. They're like, you would let me have a little bit of macadamia nuts. And I say, if that's what will help you stay consistent, then yes. And I always think once they're not feeling as well, then you could say, maybe we should try now to remove the macadamia nuts. And that's how it's just a balance. And I know you fully understand that. So I love it. With then a more meat-based diet or meat focused, how does that support the facets that you said affect brain health?
Oh, so that's a great question. So a good deal of the inflammation and oxidative stress comes from high blood sugar levels. And for all of us with insulin resistance, this is now the majority, at least of people in the United States, and a growing, not quite the majority of most other countries, but they're catching up to us pretty quickly. For people with insulin resistance, the blood sugar will go too high after meals. If the meals contain too much carbohydrate for your metabolism, which doesn't take much, if you have insulin resistance, your morning fasting blood sugar might still be normal. Technically qualifies having type 2 diabetes until your fasting blood sugar is too high, but your blood sugar will rise too high after meals. And whenever the blood sugar rises, the brain sugar also rises because the higher the blood sugar, the higher the brain sugar. They mirror each other. And so when you're getting these blood sugar spikes, you're getting brain sugar spikes. And every time sugar is spiking in the brain, whenever there's too much sugar in the brain, that sugar literally sticks to proteins, to lipids, to DNA, to all of the important components of your brain cells, and it creates these crippled molecules called advanced glycation end products, and they're really just kind of caramelized molecules. And so because they're so sticky, they don't function anymore, and they need to be cleared away by the brain. And the way the brain begins to try to deal with these things so that they won't kind of gum up the works is the brain mounts an inflammatory response as the first step to try to clear these caramelized clumps. And so that's the inflammatory response, and that comes along with not inflammatory cytokines, these little molecules called inflammatory cytokines that are kind of like first responders, and also reactive oxygen species. So oxygen free radicals, the things we're always trying to fight with antioxidants, right, are these oxygen free radicals. So the inflammatory molecules and the oxygen free radicals are released to try to deal with all these sticky molecules. And that's how the inflammation and oxidative stress can be tied to, for example, a high sugar diet. But there are other things that can cause inflammation as well. And that's why simply eating a ketogenic diet, for example, which is one of the diets I use very frequently in my practice, doesn't always go all the way to help somebody, because there are foods, as you know, especially certain types of plant foods that can also, and also certain animal foods as well, can trigger inflammatory responses in the body, particularly for people who don't have good solid gut health, a really robust gut health. So then all kinds of food molecules that shouldn't pass into the body, and can provoke an immune response. So there are many ways that food can cause inflammation and oxidative stress, but then the insulin resistance piece, and that's the piece that restricts the brain's access to energy. The insulin resistance piece is caused primarily by high sugar, high carbohydrate diets, but also another big piece of that is just eating too much food too frequently, because whenever you eat, insulin responds. And so if your insulin levels are running too high too often because you're eating too much carbohydrate, just eating too frequently, then what happens then is the brain becomes insulin resistant, which means insulin has a harder and harder time crossing into the brain. The glucose, the sugar that the brain needs at least some of for energy, the glucose has no problem getting into the brain and waltzes in, no questions asked. But the insulin has a harder and harder time getting in. And the brain can't use glucose properly, can't process glucose properly and turn it into energy without adequate insulin. So now what you've got is a low energy brain. That's very dangerous. That will eventually lead to all kinds of mental health issues, including ultimately Alzheimer's disease in many cases.
So then if we switch to a lower carb diet, maybe ketogenic, how does the body or the brain start specifically using those ketones or fatty acids for energy for the brain?
when we lower carbohydrate enough so that insulin levels come down enough, when insulin levels come down to a certain point, that will allow fat burning to turn on. If the insulin levels are too high, you can't burn fat. It will turn the fat burning enzymes off. But when it comes down low enough, fat burning will turn on. And when you turn on fat burning, then a byproduct of burning fat is you produce ketones. And ketones the fat itself has a difficult time crossing into the brain and being used for fuel. But ketones, just like glucose, waltz into the brain, no questions asked. They're absorbed beautifully. And the higher your blood ketones, the higher your brain ketones. So those are fuel molecules that can pick up the slack. So when people with insulin resistance, which again is now the majority of Americans, when people with insulin resistance, all of us with insulin resistance, our brains don't use glucose properly. They've lost a certain amount of their ability, a certain amount of their capacity to use glucose for energy. Ketones bridge that gap. Okay. Because they can then fuel. So they can fuel about up to 2/3 or so. They can meet about 2/3 or so of the brain's total energy requirement. It takes a lot of pressure off the brain because processing glucose is messier. It's less efficient. It causes more oxidative stress and inflammation to burn 100% glucose in the brain than it does to burn a mixture of glucose and ketones.
And then in your practice, have you seen some amounts of Alzheimer's improve with a ketogenic diet? Okay.
Yeah. And so, for example, I'll share a case, which is a woman in her 60s who had mild cognitive impairment.
Okay.
She had mild cognitive impairment. This is a condition that is sort of like pre-Alzheimer's, where you're starting to have just subtle difficulties with your memory, difficulty remembering directions, things like that, would sometimes lose her car in the parking lot, those types of things for a long time. Due to a previous head injury that she'd had a number of years before. But she was very stable. Her cognition was very stable until it wasn't. And so in her 60s, her cognition began to decline and she had a lot more trouble remembering things. She'd used the same sewing machine every day for 50 years, or pretty much every day for 50 years, couldn't remember how to thread the machine. She was terrified. And so she went to her primary care doctor. The primary care doctor diagnosed her with early Alzheimer's, gave her an appointment with a neurologist for 10 weeks out. And while she was waiting for that appointment, she consulted with me. And I said, well, I think it would be really worth it for you to try a ketogenic diet. And she did. She followed it to the letter. And within a few weeks, noticed dramatic improvement in her cognition. And by the time she was able to get that appointment with the neurologist said, we can take this diagnosis off the table. Your testing is perfectly normal. So these are you don't see this in a lot of cases. And the reason why you don't see it in many cases is because people who have already lost some of their brain function often have a really difficult time learning a new diet. And so that's a big part of it. But another part of it is, I'm sure you see this in your work too, is carbohydrate addiction. People don't want to give up carbohydrates, even if you say, this might prevent this condition from getting worse. This might help improve your ability to think clearly and remember things. That addiction is so strong that sometimes people will choose to have bread, for example. Bread is a big one, over better brain health.
Wow. Yeah. And I do see that a lot. I think a lot of people don't even understand that they do have some level of food addiction. When we celebrate with food, we use any emotion with food. And then it just is pervasive in our culture to be centering around foods that are not the healthiest. So I absolutely see that. When it comes to I guess for that specific individual or that case, is there a certain type of ketogenic diet? So is it just all I need you to do is remove carbs, or is it that I need you to hit a certain amount of ketones in your bloodstream? Do you have, at least for this case?
Yeah, so this is, and again, this is where the personalization comes into play. So in the beginning, I asked her, because blood ketone levels are very important, at least I've in my experience, very important for people with cognitive decline, because these are the people who have the most difficulty turning glucose into energy. These are the ones with usually the greatest glucose processing deficit, with the most sluggish brain glucose processing. They need the more support. And so initially, I asked her to aim for ketone levels, blood ketone levels, using a blood ketone meter, of between 1 and 3 millimole.
Oh, wow. Okay.
To try to keep her ketones in that range most of the time, as often as she possibly could, every day if she could. They'll fluctuate, but and she did that. She did exactly that. But over time, she found that she could relax that a little bit, and now she keeps her ketones at around 0.7 millimole, and is still doing very, very well. So whether a certain degree of healing took place, which does happen on ketogenic diets, whether a certain degree of healing took place and that allowed her to be more flexible, or whether she never needed ketones to be that high in the first place, is something, these are the types of things that we need to research. But when you look at the clinical trials of ketogenic diets in Alzheimer's disease, the results are very, very modest. You usually see very minimal, just a little bit of improvement on cognitive testing. But the most rigorous clinical trial done so far, the average ketone level was 0.95 millimole, so just below 1 millimole.
Right.
Maybe it was because the ketones weren't high enough. It's hard to know.
That's interesting. So before I was carnivore, I was keto for about, I think, almost a year, but I was still plant-based. I would still fall into my eating disorder behaviors, but in that time, my ketones were between, I think, 4 and 7 on typical days. So I wonder. Right. And I think it was because I was eating a lot of fat with not enough protein. And so that's how I was getting such high ketones.
Yeah.
And I think I did a lot of healing, because nowadays I don't track my fat and protein. I've been mostly carnivore for almost 6 years. And if I do check my ketones in the morning, it's like 0.4, 0.5. And there's been no difference in terms of, I don't struggle with depression anymore. So I do believe at that point, maybe I needed that level of therapeutic keto, but it's kind of hard to stay consistent with that high levels of ketones.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And now I just eat fatty meats, and occasionally I'll have some plants, but that has been enough so that I'm not sick. And I think you're right. I think for me personally, or at least my N=1, the ketones in the beginning being that high may have helped me, but at least now I don't need it to be that high and I still can thrive. So it makes a lot of sense what you're saying.
And your pattern, a lot of people notice that pattern. Some have more metabolic flexibility than others. And it also depends on the food choices, right? So I think when people, and I know this for myself because I've done, very strict carnivore for long periods of time. I've done carnivore-ish with a few plants thrown in for long periods of time. And I've done, kind of traditional keto for long periods of time. They're not metabolically the same. And I'm not even sure I can 100% explain why not, but they are different. And so I know people on a carnivore diet, myself included, you don't need the ketones to be as high to get the benefits on a carnivore diet for whatever reason, in most cases, as you do on a diet that's including some plant food. So it's partly about the construction of the diet, and it's partly about the construction of the person, I guess.
No, I think that totally makes sense. So just out of curiosity, in your own personal, of those 3 diets, since you've had a significant amount of time in all of them, was there one diet over the other that you felt better?
A strict carnivore diet, no question, hands down, the best for my health and overall, and in terms of preoccupation with food, completely disappeared. Yes. Something I'd never experienced before. And even on any other kind of diet, my weight went to a very kind of naturally good place without my having to really think about it. So for my health, my metabolism, my mental health, in terms of my relationship with food, all of that was really excellent on a strict, we're talking very strict carnivore diet, but it was difficult to socially, especially when traveling. And I have some food sensitivities, even on a carnivore diet, which are very challenging when traveling, including histamine intolerance. I don't tolerate eggs. I don't tolerate any kind of smoked or aged meats or preserved meats of any kind. I don't tolerate beef or pork. And so really challenging to travel. And I travel a lot. So most of the time, I probably now I'd say maybe 95%. I mean, I eat a few plants here and there, but not every day.
Right.
Because the one thing I did find when I was a very strict carnivore was that if anything else snuck in, if I was at a restaurant or anything like there was any, I would have very severe kind of exaggerated food reactions. And so that was a problem for me being a strict carnivore, given how much I travel. And there were times when I didn't have complete control over my food. So I may still return to strict carnivore. I've definitely been thinking about it again lately, but I would say that was the absolute best for my physical and mental health.
Yeah, I would have to agree. It's funny. So on social media, if I share that now I went from plant-based, struggled with an eating disorder, and now I'm free of an eating disorder with the all meat carnivore diet. And a lot of the people that are not carnivores would say she just traded one eating disorder for another. And they never understand that while our food options are limited, you get so much food freedom that you will never understand. So I totally understand that. And then my family is meat-based, but they're not carnivore. So it became really difficult when I got really strict and I said I can't have any seasonings or herbs or if they're using black pepper. And so we couldn't even go to a standard barbecue restaurant because they had rubs on it. And it became very difficult for our family. So I started to just challenge my eating disorder, I think year 3 of strict carnivore. And it's definitely probably caused a little bit more inflammation, but the balance of life, the real life balance is so important with my family. So now they're not just limited to one restaurant with me and we can go to several and I know what I can pick and choose. So I completely empathize with what you just mentioned.
It's true. And, in a perfect world, that's the way I would eat. But we don't live in a perfect world and I'm not a perfect person. But I will say that socially, I agree with you. Socially, it was extremely difficult. And I think the other thing I would say about that is that I want to come back to to the criticism that people have of, oh, you're just trading one eating disorder for another. The carnivore diet was the only diet that completely resolved my eating issues. I mean, ketogenic diet does an excellent job, but it's not as good. And so I wouldn't have expected that. That's not why the reason why I switched to a pure carnivore diet at that time was not to try to address residual issues with my relationship with food. It was to deal with some perimenopausal symptoms I was having and some weight gain and so forth. And so that was, I didn't know what else to do since my diet was already pretty strict. So I tried that and I was extremely surprised. I was never looking for that benefit. I had never experienced that level of quiet before in my mind around food.
No, and I totally understand that. And that's why I always say to people, even if you think this diet is so crazy, if you have any type of mental and physical symptoms, just try it for 100 days. Maybe you start with 30 days and then try to push it out a little bit longer. But once you feel that term that people call zero carb zen, there's a level of just peace you feel and yes. You'll notice symptoms that you've never even realized were symptoms go away. And I was interviewing a different dietitian, and she said that I think there's I don't know if it's an enzyme, but it's anandamide, and that has a calming effect. And it's in fatty meats. It's similar to THC in the system. And so people that eat lots of fatty meat may have that type of effect, just like THC does on the brain. And so that's just something to consider. And it may be part of the reason why carnivores tend to be a little bit more relaxed and not as hyperactive, I would say, but it is definitely interesting.
That is interesting. I'd never heard that before, so I'll have to look into that.
Yeah. I'll send it to you offline. But a question. So a lot of people will say Alzheimer's runs in my family or mental illness is a genetic thing. My dad struggled with depression as I did too. Is it fully genetics? Is it lifestyle? What are your thoughts with that?
There are many answers to that question. But, one of the things that we were taught when I was studying biology and then was studying medicine and was studying psychiatry is, kind of genes load the gun and lifestyle pulls the trigger kind of thing. I don't know if you'd ever heard that expression before, but the way I look at it is that the majority of what we face in terms of our chronic diseases, the majority of what we face are lifestyle induced, meaning I think that the genes we have will make us vulnerable to particular types of problems, but that those problems in most cases will not manifest themselves unless you eat in a way that will turn those genes on. And so, for example, there are many mental health conditions that, quote, run in families. Let's say that, for example, insulin resistance plays a role in the initiation of certain mental health conditions. Let's say that insulin resistance plays a role in, and we know it does, in bipolar disorder, for example, and in Alzheimer's disease, depression, psychotic illnesses. It plays a role. Right. If you and I eat the same diet, I might develop depression, whereas you might develop Alzheimer's disease, or I might develop type 2 diabetes, whereas you might develop fatty liver disease. And I think the way in which our diet makes us ill, that's what depends on our genes. And so, but if we eat well, if we eat properly, and we know this from looking at sort of previous hunter-gatherer populations and so forth, when we eat sort of a more human-appropriate diet, we're generally physically healthy. We don't become obese. We don't develop type 2 diabetes. We don't develop serious mental illnesses, except in very, very rare cases. And so I think it's largely lifestyle, and that the genes determine how things will go wrong, but they don't determine that things will go wrong.
And that makes sense. I think, for example, in our family, we will start having type 2 diabetes way earlier on. We don't get super obese, we get diabetic. And then I'll see other friends that they're 100 pounds more overweight than I am, but they don't have diabetes. And it might just manifest as maybe they suffer from cholesterol. So I totally see that, depending on, I guess you could almost think of it as the gun may be different based on your family. If your lifestyle and diet is relatively human or species appropriate, then it may never load the gun. So it doesn't matter what kind of gun you have, in a sense. So
exactly.
Yeah. So that makes a lot of sense. For all the research you've done and what you've experienced, why are we told that diet has nothing to do with mental illness?
Well, oh my gosh, why are we told that? I think that there's a huge disconnect between the brain and the body within the field of psychiatry and within the field of medicine in general. It's very interesting to think about, because neurologists and psychiatrists, we both treat brain illnesses and think about brain illnesses, which are diseases of the brain, but we think about them very differently. So neurologists think about diseases of the brain as physical, concrete illnesses where there's something wrong. There's the cells are misfiring, or there's the proteins are not working properly, something like that. So neurologists think of brain illnesses as physical and as treatable, and psychiatrists think of brain illnesses kind of mysterious and incurable, and maybe there's a chemical imbalance, but we don't really know exactly which chemicals might be imbalanced, or if they're imbalanced in you. We don't have any test we can run to tell you what your brain chemicals look like. We don't have any genetic tests we can offer you to say this is why you're depressed, and we don't know which medication to try first, because it's all just trial and error. And I think whereas neurologists might take a brain scan or a brain image and say, oh, okay, there's a tumor there, or oh, there's something structurally wrong that we can do something about, or there's a seizure that we can measure your brain seizure activity. Psychiatrists don't have tools like that. And so it's a lot of guesswork, and it's still, even in 2023. So I think that the idea that what we eat could affect mental health is even one step removed from that. So first, psychiatry as a field would need to think about brain illnesses as rooted in brain health, in overall brain health, not just kind of, oh, you've inherited a chemical imbalance in your brain, and the only thing we know what to do about it is try to find a medicine to correct it. We have to think about root causes. And I think psychiatrists don't think about biological root causes enough. So in 4 years of psychiatry residency training, so 4 years of medical school and then 4 years of psychiatry residency training, in the 4 years of psychiatry residency training, we didn't learn about the brain. We didn't have lectures or classes or workshops or anything on brain anatomy, on brain function, on how does the brain work? And so we were taught about psychotherapy, we were taught about medication, we were taught about relationship, to take a relationship history, a family history, a symptom history. We were not taught to order blood tests. We were not taught to think about metabolism, how the brain gets energy. How does the brain make serotonin in the first place? What components do you need to even make a serotonin molecule in the brain? So there's a big kind of a gap in understanding. And I'm not saying that that's anybody's fault. It's just the culture of the field, the way that psychiatrists are trained. And so we really need a revolution. We need to train medical students and psychiatrists what the relationship is between food, metabolism, and brain health. Those links are not being made. They for many, many, many years were not made for physical health. Right. For a long time, we didn't think that what you ate had anything to do with most chronic diseases. So
yeah, so I studied psychology at Cal, and you're right. I never had an anatomy or brain class. It was always learning about the greats of Carl Jung and all these other psychotherapists, but and all these fascinating studies that I loved, but there was never the physical anatomy of the brain and how it functions and how any metabolism or metabolic health affects it. So you're right. I never thought that even through this whole time I've been a nutritional therapist. I've never thought, you're right. I never learned about brain health in that whole, or the physical brain in that whole 4-year study. Do you think there are specific foods that are more triggering to the body or even the brain health than other foods? So you mentioned earlier, less benign plant foods. So what would you say are some of the specific plants? I think you mentioned legumes and grains. Are there any other?
Yes, absolutely. So sugar, obviously, linoleic acid and vegetable oils, grains, legumes, nightshades. Nightshades contain neurotoxins. And then cassava, which is becoming
so popular.
Finding its way into all kinds of processed foods. That's another good example. So there are certain foods that contain neurotoxins. And so cassava, for example, produces cyanide, and cyanide is a mitochondrial poison. And so that's the last thing you want, is to poison your mitochondria with your food. So mitochondria are what create energy in the first place, and the brain needs energy. You don't want to poison your brain, any of your mitochondria, let alone the ones in your brain. And so just because it's plant-based doesn't mean that it's good for you. As all of your viewers know, plants defend themselves with toxins, with chemical weapons. And as some plant foods are more aggressive than others and more dangerous than others. The grains and legumes, in my opinion, are not fit for human consumption. Okay. Neither is any more than a tiny bit of linoleic acid. The body and brain simply do not know what to do with linoleic acid. It winds up in all kinds of places, and all kinds of things happen to it that shouldn't be happening. So vegetable oils, sugar, grains, legumes, nightshades, those are usually and all of the seed foods. So grains, beans, nuts, and seeds are all seeds. These are the most heavily defended part of the plant. These are the future generation of the plant. These are where you find all your lectins and all your defensive chemical. The plant will go to the greatest lengths to protect the embryo of its embryos. Those are the foods that are the most dangerous, I think, to our gut health, to our immune health, to our brain health.
So if I struggle with mental health, what should I do? I know diet's one. Would you get them on a ketogenic? I know it's super individualized, so it's kind of a loaded question, I know, but how should I get started without being overwhelmed? If I'm just eating the standard American diet, I hear this and I'm just tired of being sick. Maybe I've tried the antidepressants and they don't work enough. How do I start with the diet without overwhelming myself?
So this is a great question. So I've written a book about this that will be coming out next year in January, to walk people through the different steps they can take, because this is such an important question. I wouldn't want everybody to plunge themselves into a ketogenic diet. I wouldn't want everybody to plunge themselves into a carnivore diet. I wouldn't want everybody to make drastic changes to their diet without understanding. I mean, I think the point of the book that I'm writing is to help people understand which dietary changes are most worth making and why, so that you'll have the right information to make your own decisions. Because right now, as you know, all the information we have about how to make your diet healthier, almost all of it is wrong.
Right.
And so if you're trying really, if you're trying to follow a healthier diet for brain health, a lot of the information you'll be getting is, things like eat steel cut oatmeal in the morning, top it with fresh blueberries, have some dark chocolate, drink more red wine, unbelievably dangerous recommendations for brain health, particularly for people who already have insulin resistance. And again, that's the majority of us. So what I do in this book, and I'll explain to you now so people can hear the steps, is the first thing I recommend, if you're going to do a dietary overhaul, the Mediterranean diet's a little better than the standard American diet. And although it's not hard to beat the standard American diet, it is a little better. It's a little higher in quality, right? It has less junk in it. And it does include animal food. So it is a little better. And the studies show that compared to a standard American diet, it is better. But you can do so much more. So I recommend as the first step, not the Mediterranean diet, but a paleo diet. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is because it removes the grains and the legumes and the sugar and the vegetable oils and all the modern processed foods. And it even removes dairy, which I think is a really good idea for most people to try. So I like to start with a paleo diet. And then for people who still have high blood sugar or high insulin levels on a paleo diet, or don't feel well on a paleo diet, or don't benefit enough, most of those people, there are some exceptions, most of those people could then benefit by transitioning to a ketogenic diet. And then if that doesn't help enough, if ketones themselves, if putting yourself into this different metabolic state doesn't help you enough, then you might want to consider a carnivore diet. And so there are these kind of different levels that people can engage with depending on their personal situation and also what they feel willing to try.
Right. And I see that a lot in the progression of people in the diet space. So they say, I was keto or paleo for a certain amount of time, and then they went keto and now they're at carnivore. So that completely makes sense. Is there a title for your book?
Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind.
Oh, okay. I love it. I love it. And you just mentioned dairy. So I'm curious your thoughts. I've always been open to dairy. I guess I never thought I really had an issue with it. Lately, there's been this trend. People are eating sticks and sticks of butter. I'm starting to see clients. So they may notice I'm sleeping better, maybe because they have enough fat for their sex hormones. But what I'm seeing is their triglycerides are shooting up to the 200s and something.
Yes.
And so I had one client, unfortunately, she tried ruling out everything. She finally took out the butter. And that was the one thing that moved the needle for her Hashimoto's, her antibodies for thyroid health. So I'm starting to see why paleo diet removes dairy. I hate to say it. Maybe raw dairy, some people can use after they heal their gut, but I just wanted your take on dairy as well.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, love-hate relationship with dairy because of course it's delicious. And, many dairy foods, especially the higher fat, low lactose or sugar-free dairy products, things like heavy cream and sour cream and hard cheeses and butter, things like that are very keto friendly, right? And for some, there are so many different definitions of carnivore. One definition of carnivore includes dairy. And so, isn't it wonderful that you can just have your meat, but you can also have butter on top of your meat or whatever else you like. So it's a wonderful, delicious, versatile, high fat animal food, right? But we're really not cut out to eat it beyond a certain age, and especially not from another species. So when we are consuming really what milk is it's a species specific growth formula. And so we are designed to have human milk up to maybe a few years of age. It's designed for humans. And after a certain age, we are supposed to graduate to solid food and we're not supposed to have milk anymore. And that's why so many of us can't digest milk. Huge numbers of people around the world can't digest the sugar in milk, which is lactose. But that's not really a major health issue. It's just kind of a nuisance. You can take enzymes or have, lactose-free dairy products. The problem is the dairy proteins. And the dairy proteins, they're designed to put baby cows into growth mode. So they turn on the hormones in our systems that are related to growth. And so they raise insulin levels, they raise IGF-1 levels, and they can also, we have a very difficult time digesting these proteins because we don't have rennet, which cows have in their stomach, to baby cows, to digest the milk. So we get these partially digested dairy proteins, which if you have any gut issues can cross into the bloodstream and provoke an immune reaction. So a lot of people, including myself, have inflammatory reactions to dairy that go away when we stop eating dairy. And most people, at least in Western societies, have been eating dairy products since they were extremely young, virtually every day. And they really don't notice that whatever the issue is, I've always been a headachy person. I've always been an anxious person. I've always had, aches and pains, what have you. I've always had a weight plateau. I can't break this weight plateau. Migraines is a very common cause of migraines and a very common cause of skin problems, rashes and eczema and psoriasis, unexplained skin issues. So acne, huge cause of acne. So when you take the dairy out, that's the only way you can really tell how it's been affecting you. And it's unusual for me to run across a person who doesn't notice some benefit from removing it as an experiment. It's worth exploring. I mean, there are some people who tolerate it certainly much better than others, but it's a very common cause of weight gain, of food addiction, because it turns on your appetite, right? You're growing, you're supposed to be growing. So it turns on your appetite hormones, makes you hungry, makes people feel achy, and causes all kinds of digestive and skin, et cetera. Again, how it affects you will depend on your genes. So it's not going to look the same in each person.
Yeah, I've seen people that will get into a ketogenic state mostly using dairy, and they don't fare as well, even if they have some level of ketones. When they're just downing heavy cream, which is also the ones that we get are oftentimes ultra pasteurized, and it's even a lot more processed than even natural heavy cream, and they're not well. So that's like the first thing I have them remove, because in the morning they're like, oh, I add heavy cream and butter to my coffee, and then I don't have my next meal until several hours later. And so their keto or their fat, they might be eating 80% fat in terms of total calories, but when you write down what they're eating in a day, it's mostly from dairy. And then it's usually the reason why they're feeling so much inflammation.
Yes, exactly. And so when any clinician who's experimented with this in their practice will notice this connection between dairy and inflammation, and just dairy and weight plateaus, and dairy and food addiction. I've had some patients who cannot stop binge eating unless they completely remove dairy from their diet. Wow. And when they do that, then they're home free. So it really is a very common culprit for all kinds of different problems.
So as we're closing, any tips for the people that are watching, whether it's about mental health or fine-tuning the diet?
Yeah, I think for everybody out there who might be struggling with a mental health issue, well, first of all, if you've never tried any kind of a special diet, I think the first step that I would recommend that you do before you even think about changing your diet is, and this is what I do with all of my clients and patients, is just to figure out where you stand right now metabolically. And it's not difficult to do. Find out, do you have insulin resistance? Do you have high blood sugar levels? And so do you have high triglycerides? There's a certain, is your waist circumference more than half of your height? Are your triglycerides over 100 milligrams per deciliter? Is your blood sugar going up over 125 milligrams per deciliter an hour after you eat? These are the types of things that you can even look sometimes at the lab tests you've already had to figure these things out. Or you can just use a tape measure at home, or get a blood stick, a finger stick blood meter, or borrow one from a friend or family member who uses a finger stick blood glucose meter, and just see what your glucose is running. Because if your blood sugar is running too high, if your triglycerides are running too high, if you tend to gain weight around the middle, those are all signs that you have insulin resistance. And if you have insulin resistance, it's really important to change your diet, lower the amount of carbohydrate in your diet. The best first step is to take out the sugar and the flour, all the refined carbohydrates. The sugar and the flour can go first. There are many other things you can do after that, but that's a great first step. And so to take out all the refined sugars and starches and just eat whole foods, whole plant and animal foods, but whichever ones you like. Don't worry about the minutia during the first step. Just clean up your diet to try to get your blood sugar levels in a healthier range. Because if your blood sugar and insulin levels are running too high, that is damaging over time, damaging your brain's ability to access energy. And it's also damaging the brain structure from the inside out. It's one of the most important things you can do is get your blood sugar and insulin levels in a healthy range. And then explore other dietary options, because we now have so many different strategies that can be personalized and to help you feel better. But the first step is just step away from the processed carbohydrates. That's the very first step. And it's not easy. That can take some practice. So maybe set that as your first goal. And, Judy can help you with steps after that.
No, I love it. I love that. I think that makes so much sense. If people can handle the step down approach, or just cleaning up the diet in that way, it makes so much sense. There's some people that are so all or nothing. And so that step down approach may be harder, but that's where I think it becomes really personalized. I think you have a practitioner program or some type of training, and the only reason I know about it is because I've had other practitioners tell me about it and say that it's wonderful. Can you share a little bit about what that is?
Oh yeah, thanks. So I'm glad to talk about it. So I Ketogenic Diets for mental health clinician training program. It's certified for CME credits for a variety of different types of medical practitioners, including nurses and PAs and MDs. And it's also certified for nutrition professionals through the American Nutrition Association. So this is it's called Ketogenic Diets for Mental Health, and you can find out about them on the website if you want to join a class. And this is the only program of its kind in the world, at least right now. And so I'm really really enjoy. It's a small group. It's a small group live online training where we have 6 clinicians at a time. We get to know each other over 5 weeks, and we learn from each other, and we share cases and stories, and it's really so much fun for me to meet other people from all around the world who with different backgrounds, different clinical backgrounds, who already have, in some cases, a lot of experience in this field and just want to kind of shore up the mental health piece. Or who want to learn about these methods for the first time. So that's the clinician training program. And the other thing I want to mention is, if you've got people out there listening who are looking for a clinician to work with them on a low carbohydrate or ketogenic diet or carnivore diet for mental health, specifically for mental health, there's also now I have a clinician directory completely free to search. So also on the website, if you just click on clinician directory, so you can search, it's an international database, and you can find clinicians of various kinds, coaches, MDs, nurse practitioners, social workers, dietitians, who will be want to work with you to help you improve your mental health using dietary strategies.
Okay. So I will put all of that information in the show notes. I hear such good things about your program, especially the practitioner program. So thank you for everything. And I said this to you offline, but I just want to say it for the community. But when I was first joining the community 5-6 years ago, I ran into your work, fell in love with all your work and who you are. And I just want to show gratitude. I think if you didn't put out so much of your content and the chance of me healing with my mental illness, I don't know if I'd be here. So I think you pay gratitude where it's needed. And I have so much respect for you. I actually went to Carnivore Con, and you were one of the reasons I went. So I was just part of the audience back then. But yeah, I have so much respect for you. So I just wanted to take a moment and thank you.
You were there, Judy? Oh, that was just a wonderful conference, wasn't it? Well, I am so glad you are here on the planet, and I am so glad that you are using your story to help other people. I mean, you've got really a very powerful story of healing that I think is really inspirational to people. And the other thing I want to thank you for is for being a female clinician in this space, because it's really sometimes very difficult for women to think about meat as something that's good for them. We often think of meat as something that's good for men, and that women shouldn't have much way of meat. We should be eating big salads. And so I really want to thank you for being not just to live by example, but also healing and teaching people and kind of showing people the way. So thanks for everything you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. I really believe humans were meant to live in communities and then pay it forward. So if you heal, you share your story so others heal as you did in your story. So just thank you so much. I'm so looking forward to your book. I will be the first in line to get it. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk with all of your followers.
And then where can people find you? Are you online? I know your website's Diagnosis Diet, but if you can share a little bit more.
Yeah, so the website's Diagnosis Diet, and that's where you can find the information about the training program, and you can find the clinician directory and all kinds of free articles about a lot of these topics. And I'm on social media. I'm on Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter, but I'm most active on Twitter. And so if you're trying to engage with me about something, that's the best place to try to do that. And I'm speaking at lots of conferences in the coming months, which there's a list of them on the front page of my website if you want. And that's in the United States as well as in Europe. So I hope to meet you somewhere soon.
And then your social media handles, just for.
I'm sorry. So Twitter is at Georgia Eid MD, and my last name is EDE.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you again so much for your time. This has been amazing. So I hope that people will try to use diet and lifestyle to start working on their mental health.
It's the first place to start. It's always the first place to look.
Okay, guys, I hope you enjoyed this interview. If anything, I hope that this interview shows that there are other things and areas that you can look into other than starting to pop a pill first. Some people may need it in certain situations, but always be very thoughtful and mindful because there's also issues of withdrawal. At this point, there is so much information and research that shows that maybe serotonin imbalances or other chemical imbalances are not the root cause of a lot of these low moods and mental illnesses. We have to consider our diet, lifestyle, the home, our environment, and see if there are levers that we can pull that may actually improve our mood and our mental health. Popping a pill is not always the best answer. Our goal is always to get you to root cause healing. And while that may not always be the easiest answer, it is the answer that can give you the most optimal health. All right, guys, make sure to eat a lot of meat, take care of your bodies and your minds because it is the only place you have to live. I will talk to you later. Bye, guys.